Now, changing the D over C ratio then is going to affect the state that you're in, and then eventually the cycle. So, if D over C is lowered, you lower the D over C ratio, you're going to force chaos in this system. One way that's happened in some of the communities that I've studied is a new highway comes into a fairly isolated Canada northern community. When that new road comes in, it suddenly raises the level of centrality. Here's this new road coming in, people are coming down the road, lots of new businesses setting up, all kinds of things are coming down that new highway. Centrality goes up, and it's fairly obvious that what happens in the community then is it becomes chaotic. Here are all these newcomers driving in on the road. They don't know how to handle them, they don't have the services, the differentiation level, and the community becomes chaotic. And it does. It's happened in certainly northern Alaska when the pipeline was built. It's happened in many single enterprise communities when they've suddenly been opened up to the outside. Canada in its early years, we had a very low level of differentiation. Canada didn't have many skills. We had a few stable industries, but we were connected to the United States, to France, to Britain, who made all kinds of demands on us. And Canada was pretty chaotic, relatively speaking, in its early years. As the D over C ratio goes up, then systems become very ordered. And you can imagine a cult. The example I think of is the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, were surrounded by the Bureau of, weirdly enough, alcohol, tobacco, and something or other. So they were surrounded by all these armed weapons, totally isolated. They wanted to talk to the media. They were told you can't talk to the media. And that cult, Branch Davidians, became extremely focused and ordered. So dangerous that there's a lot of evidence that if they didn't start the fire that consumed them, they certainly sacrificed themselves in the fire. They were so focused, they died in a mass kind of suicide. That's what happens if you really isolate it. And so every time the world decides a trade embargo is a way to punish a country like Cuba or Iraq, thinking of Iran, what you're going to do is raise the focus of those nations. They're going to become extremely focused and very dangerous, in fact, if this isolation continues. The centrality has fallen so low that they've got all these skills, this differentiation. And in between then you get a complex level. And I'm not going to go into this very much. Complexity is the most least understood of the states. When people talk about the zone in sports, we really don't understand what happens. It's just a very magical kind of moment. It often occurs during times of change in organizations when the markets are changing. You're going from a manufacturing basis to a more information technology. You're going to find a lot of complex behavior. Okay, so, right, and it's the transition then between these three major states that leads to cycles. So I'll go back now to the groups that Jim talked about. And this was fascinating for us because we had talked about complexity science. We used to get together for lunch once a month. We even had a meeting that went on over a period of 3 years, experts from different fields at the university, very diverse. And so we had a lot of this theory, and then we met John Campbell, who is a facilitator of groups. That's all he does. He knows nothing about physical sciences, social sciences. He focuses on making groups work better. And he had put together all his notes on what happened in groups. And I'd like to say we read it one night and said, right, there it is, we can explain it. Well, it took about a year of meeting with John and talking about it, but we think it's a really good example of what happens in cycles. And Jim's already given you what John did, and I'll just say very briefly in our terms, to go from order to chaos, all these people coming from ordered organizations, expecting organization, in order to shake them out of this order, Jim introduced these weird, music and art, and the room would just be covered with these weird things going on, and John is about our age, but he would be dancing around the room, and which I would never do. I'd never do that. Ridiculous. But I mean, John just overwhelmed them with new information. He raised the level of centrality, a lot of exercises to pour information in them. And pretty soon that room just became chaotic. It was, some people actually left at that point. They just couldn't take it anymore. The second transition from chaos into complexity was the really delicate one. He became a real expert at just introducing enough differentiation, enough rules to raise the D over C ratio and move them into complexity. And as he said himself, he never knew whether it would work. And sometimes it didn't, actually. The group would just collapse. And they'd move too far into chaos. Sometimes somebody in the group would take over and it would become too ordered, and they'd lose all this creative realm of complexity. But when it worked, well, you heard the comments that Jim read. It was absolutely magical. The members of it said nothing like that had ever happened to them before. The day would go by. One person would start to say something and somebody over there would finish the sentence. It was absolutely magical when they were in the zone, in the realm of complexity. And Jim did it by carefully introducing differentiation. Just raising the number of rules. For instance, you couldn't make negative comments about someone, so he restricted information, increased differentiation. And then in the final stage, as Jim said, you had to go back to organizations. He gave them this toolkit full of repetitive exercises they were to do every day. They were to write down about the organization, what they had to do. So he introduced more and more differentiation so that they could handle the real world. Because remember, they were coming from a little group like this back to the real world with higher centrality. They had to be really gird their loins with differentiation, so they had a lot of skills they could take back to handle that centrality. So their D over C ratio would remain fairly ordered. So, you don't remember all the details. Remember that according to us, it's systems all the way down. There's nothing wrong with talking about individual, a group, society, art, the universe. It's systems. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about discrete systems that go through cycles that look very similar, and particularly if you have a system that's one system with a lot of subsystems. When you look at the system, the subsystem, the sub-subsystem, all the way down, the shape of the changes, the cycles will be similar, they'll be fractal. And the reason for that, we're saying, now we're using the term social focusing, you could use it for any kind of focusing, but whether it's fuzzy, whether it's sharply defined, or whether it's somewhere in between, depends on the D over C ratio. Over time, then, you get cycles. So, what we're going to talk about was going to be a bit of a discussion, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll talk about a particular application of our theory to art cycles, particularly the Pearl. And then Jim will talk about some other ways we think it can be applied. So anyway.